Thank you to all three of our guests for speaking with us this afternoon. We're going to try to end this on time and perhaps a minute or two earlier because we have some people that have to make an airplane schedule. And we would welcome questions from the audience. I actually can't see very well because of these lights, so if there's someone running around with a microphone, is that happening? Oh, there's a microphone in the middle of the aisle here if you care to get up and ask a question. But let me start off perhaps, or pick up where Deborah left off, pointing out that there would be some devices possibly that would not be approved if the comparative effectiveness research is done early in that device's life because of the evolutionary nature of devices and the improvement in skill level that is required for devices, which obviously differs from a molecule. I suppose there probably is skill in delivering molecules in various ways, but by and large, they don't change over the life of the patent, and they pretty much are administered in a consistent way. So there is the potential for innovation to be stifled by premature effectiveness research. And I'd like to ask Andrew if he'd comment on the experience in the UK and how you address that concern. I'm sure you're in favor of innovation and progress there, as you've already indicated. How do you manage the balance there?
Well, it is a risk, that's true. And those who are involved in taking the decisions, but in our case, our independent advisory bodies, need to be conscious of the impacts of the decisions that they're taking on a product. It's true for pharmaceuticals as it is for devices and diagnostics, at the point at which the product's being introduced into the healthcare system. There's a number of things that you can do. One is to be just that, conscious of that risk, and therefore do your best to guard against it. The second is to make sure that any decision, any recommendation, any conclusion that's reached is subject to review. Now, of course, that's a bit of an issue as the catalogue of decisions grows. But we've been doing it for 10 years, and we found ways in which we can make sure that we revisit the decisions that we've taken. They do change, but actually, if we look back over the 10 years or so that we've been operating, not that many have changed. They've tended not to change because the decision on the basis of the original evidence was wrong, but just that the evidence itself for the products has accumulated over time. Now, okay, so that's logical, that's what happens in the system. But in that sense, all we're doing is, in a way, is tracking the nature of the decision-making that anybody who's making a judgment about the product would make. Early in the life of a product, you make a judgment based on the evidence that's available. You can do it optimistically and pessimistically, I accept that, but I think generally speaking, niceness advisory committees shade to the optimistic. There are some examples of where they've done that, particularly with pharmaceuticals, where there's been quite a big risk on the basis of the evidence, but they've pushed in favour of the product itself. And we've updated our guidance. It's pretty rare, though, to make a substantial change based on the evolution of the evidence base. Largely, it tends to confirm the original decision in both directions. In the very small number of circumstances where we've made a negative decision, that's the case. In other circumstances, it's pushed it the other way. So it is a risk, and it's certainly possible to get it wrong at the outset. The question is whether or not the occasions when that happens are outweighed by the benefits of this objective approach to making decisions, and certainly in our view and our experience it is.
Well, this is very interesting because as the United States embraces comparative effectiveness research, we'll have the opportunity to do some comparative effectiveness models. And we've heard the UK example. Would you like to respond, Deborah or Thomas, to the concern about innovation being threatened perhaps by premature comparative comparison?
Well, we thought a little bit about how the process by which you actually adopt technologies determines the cost effectiveness. So what I mean by that, if you look at NICE, so it's not really what we want is some objective way of doing this where we pick the most cost effective things. That's sort of the goal of the exercise. It doesn't turn out that way when manufacturers take the reimbursement environment or the incentives in the reimbursement environment into account, because if you see what happens at NICE is a lot of it gets accepted. That's not an accident. That's because they price the products to get accepted under the threshold. In fact, people will price closely up to the threshold, taking a little bit of a risk because you get higher profits if you actually have higher prices. So there is some value of having some rejections. But the vast majority are accepted because of the reimbursement. Now, what that means is that if people price up to the threshold, everything is going to look equally cost effective, even though the resources involved in producing these treatments are vastly different across drugs, devices, or procedures. So you're not really picking among objectively more cost-effective or less cost-effective procedures or drugs or devices, because the manufacturers in the reimbursements facing them have basically taken into account how the pricing affects their profits. And if you look at data at NICE, it's very similar how cost-effective these technologies are. The same is true for effectiveness. Effectiveness is also endogenous to the system because the pricing is going to determine how much adoption takes place. And when you have learning by doing, where effectiveness increases with usage, with utilization, and utilization is negatively related to prices, you will have effectiveness that's also determined by how you set the prices. So I think that the more general issue is that these procedures are not objective ways of doing things when the manufacturers faced with them are operating optimally.
So the manufacturers recognize the rules of the game and price their products accordingly to win in that environment. And it's not a fair comparison, is perhaps.
Well, it's not an objective comparison of what's good or bad technologies, because they're going to pretty much look equally good. They're going to price at the threshold, and one's going to come in at however many thousand pounds you allow per quality. And that's why you see it's not an accident that they're all accepted, because it would be a waste of money to try to undertake the effort to go to NICE and then have the product rejected because the price was too high.
Deborah, do you have anything to add to this, or should I move on to the next question?
The only thing that I think I had plenty of comment before is simply it will be interesting as there's now been that much more funding allocated to comparative effectiveness research, which it appears that a lot of it is really going to be looking at the effectiveness really downstream and what exactly outcomes from these studies are actually going to do in terms of the users, the adopters. I mean, frankly, I think that the market has already has sort of evened out in terms of which devices are already out there. But when it's farther downstream and it shifts toward the clinician and the patient in terms of deciding, okay, but I'm not going to have this procedure anymore, that technology becomes that much more obsolete in the market.